So you've created your first GraphQL API and now you need to secure it. How do you do it? That's exactly what we're going to cover today. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Dan Vega and I'm a Spring developer advocate for VMware. My mission is to help you learn Spring and the projects in our ecosystem through a series of tutorials like the one you're going to watch today. All right, so here I am over at the Tanzu Developer Center. This is a great place that provides you with everything you need to build, run, and deploy your applications. I've actually written a guide on the exact topic that we're going to go through today, and I thought I would go ahead and show you how to find it and where to find these resources in case you want to follow along. So if you head over here and go to Learn, there's a section on guides. This is broken down into different categories. You have Modern App Basics. Maybe you're modernizing a legacy application. Mine is here under Building Modern Applications. We have our Getting Started with Spring for GraphQL, which is a previous guide. This one is Spring for GraphQL Security. So I talked a little bit about the intro in here, which is, hey, in a previous guide here, I taught you how to create your first GraphQL API. If you want to check out a video version of that, I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description below on how to create your first GraphQL API in Spring. This is a little bit different of a process. If you've ever gone through how to kind of secure a REST API, this is a little bit of a different process because for starters, there's a single entry point in GraphQL. So by default /GraphQL, so you can't really lock everything down by a particular path or a resource. But don't worry, there is still a way to do it. We can get a little bit more fine-grained control on individual queries or mutations. So some prerequisites, I would go ahead and assume that you have read the first guide. And the only reason for that is we're going to start with some code. So I'm going to have a branch that you can check out, start there and follow along. But that is from the previous project that we work on. I don't want to go through all of that again. That would take us another 30 minutes, and I want to focus just on the security stuff. So read through that guide if you haven't had a chance. Go ahead and check out the repository in this branch. This is the secure JavaBucks secure repository, and there's a Start Here branch. That is a branch we're going to be working with. So this guide is basically broken down into some different sections, most of which we'll go over in the video, but we get into a little more detail here with things like authentication versus authorization, how to get started, how to configure Spring Security, Spring Security method security, so if you want to control it at a method level, how to get the authenticated principle, who is the logged in user, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. So go through this guide if you want. But what I'm going to do is jump into IntelliJ right now and start with that Start Here branch, and we'll just get going. All right, so here we are in IntelliJ. I have that repository open. We're in the Start Here branch. Again, if you want to just see the kind of finalized codes, you can check out the master branch and look at it there. So let's just walk through a couple things real quick. If you open up the POM, a couple of things in here that you'll see. We have that Spring Boot Starter GraphQL, Spring Boot Web. And we've gone ahead and added the Spring Boot Starter security dependency. This is what you'll get if you go ahead and go to start.spring.io and select Spring Security from there. You'll also get the Spring GraphQL testing support when you choose GraphQL. So just a little bit about the project. Again, we've kind of already gone through this if you've watched or if you went through the last guide. But just to walk through it, we have a couple controllers here, the coffee controller. So we have a way to find all the coffee order or products and a way to create a new coffee product. We also have an order controller with a single method in there to find all of the orders in the system. We kind of have models to back all these up. You can see most of these are records, and then we have an enum for size. And then we have some services. Again, most of these are the same. I didn't want to bother with having to connect to a database. We're just going to kind of create an in-memory collection here. So we have a list of coffees and then all of these methods to support it. CRUD methods, find all. And then there's a post construct, which will go ahead and get called when this is instantiated and create 3 new coffees. You'll find a similar pattern in the order service and in the user service as well. So with that, nothing else really special. We have our GraphQL schema here. I guess there's one thing I'll point out. There is a custom Scholar type called date time, which is not a built-in Scholar type. The way that I got this in here is by using the GraphQL config here. I'm using a runtime wire configure to go ahead and add a new scholar type, which is called datetime. And I get those from adding this other dependency here, the GraphQL Java extended scholars. So if you want to see some more details on that, if you're not quite sure how we do that and how to customize that, and you're interested in a tutorial on that, go ahead and leave me a comment below on that. So we have our GraphQL schema here. And what we want to do now is go ahead and start this up. I just want to start the application. Now that we've added Spring Security to it, what are we getting out of the box? And as you see, there's some logging going on, and then we get this using generated security password. So Spring Security takes a secure by default approach. And this means that all of your routes are going to be locked down by default, and you'll need to open them up to traffic as needed, as opposed to us leaving everything open and you having to lock things down. This is a much more preferred approach to security. So there is a default username that gets created when you don't create any configuration, and Spring Boot kind of sets up a default configuration for you. You get a user, the username is user, and the password is this generated password here. So we're going to copy that. And the reason we do that is we don't want you to end up going to production with some demo application with a username and password that can be easily Googled, right? So we're just kind of protecting you from doing that. We should not use this username and password in production. This is just for demo purposes. So with that, if I go over to localhost 8080, there is a graphical endpoint where you can go ahead and test out, validate your queries. So if I go ahead and try and reload this, you're going to see by default, I get this user login. So if I go ahead and type in user and I paste in that password that was generated, you see that I am taken to the graphical playground. And by the way, if you've been following along, this is a new graphical playground. This is GraphQL 2. I'll try and put together a video on that, even though it doesn't take, it's pretty self-explanatory, but a lot of new nice features in GraphQL 2. Okay, so we are able to log in. Again, Spring Security is securing everything by default, and we get that default user. So what we're going to do now is kind of override that default configuration and go ahead and create our own configuration. So I want to create a new Java class in the config package. We're going to call this security config. We're going to go ahead and mark this as a configuration class, and we're going to use the @enable web security annotation. Quick side note, I've seen a lot of people say you don't need this anymore, which is kind of true, but kind of not true. So what happens is Spring Boot will actually add this annotation if you forget to add it. So if you don't want the bother of us having to look to see if you added it or not, I would say just go ahead and be explicit and add that annotation. So the security config used to extend something called the Web Security Configure Adapter. I just did a video on this. I'll go ahead and leave a card for this or a link in the description below. But we are moving away from that. If you're creating a project on Spring Boot 2.7 or later, so we are on 2.7.3, we are definitely in that range. Then you don't want to, we've deprecated that class. There's an abstract class that used to extend and override some methods. We've deprecated that, and we want to move to a more component-based model. And so what we're going to do, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start by creating a bean. This is going to be of type security filter chain, and we'll call this security filter chain. This is going to take in our HTTP security. So that'll take in HTTP. We're going to return http.build. We'll come back with this in just a second. Oops. We are going to add an exception. And let's start to configure this. So there's a few things that we need to configure. We're going to start with cross-site request forgery, and we are going to say CSRF. We're going to disable that. And we're going to set up authorized requests. So we're going to say auth. And auth, what we want to do is we just want to go ahead and say any request, we want you to be authenticated. This is similar to the approach that was given to us by Spring Boot out of the box. We just kind of want to replicate that for now. I also want to go ahead and set up some session management here. So I want to say session, and I want to say session.create session policy. We're going to create a stateless policy. We don't need session management in this case. And finally, I want to set up HTTP basic. So HTTP basic, and we're going to use the defaults provided, and that should be it. So now what we do is we're basically using HTTP basic as the authentication mechanism. So again, authentication versus authorization. We kind of talk about that in the guide, right? So this is how we're going to authenticate. So now if we go ahead and restart this, let's start this back up. See if no errors. We still have this user generated password here. If I go ahead and refresh this, now we are getting this browser-based login box. So I didn't create this login form. This is coming from the browser in HTTP basic world. So we're going to say user, paste that in, and here we are. So far so good. We are making some roads here. We are getting somewhere. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about managing users, but I do want to talk about one quick thing here. So my first inclination was to come in here and say MVC matchers / graphical and say permit all, right? Like I don't want to have to log into the graphical user interface. Here's the problem with this. Let's just, actually I'll just talk through it. We don't need to go see it. You can just take my word for it. But when that graphical user interface loads, it's actually going to make a post request to /GraphQL as part of the tool. That's what it does. It makes a quick check to that GraphQL endpoint. So to make this work, not only would you have to permit that, but you'd also have to go ahead and permit /GraphQL, and you can get specific with this and say a post. But here's the problem with this. If we're permitting this, this is the single endpoint that all of our GraphQL queries are executed on. So then we're basically opening up our entire endpoint, which was kind of defeating the purpose of what we're trying to do today. So I think for now, I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this. You can get an environment in here, so you can, come in here and say AutoWire in my environment and check to see what environment we're in. But for now, I'm just going to take the approach of I want to lock everything down. Let's be more secure. I'm okay with that. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create a couple users. So I'm going to create another bean here. We're going to say this is the user. Actually, this is going to be our in-memory user details manager. We'll call this users. And what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to create a couple of users. So I'm going to say user details. User is equal to user dot with default password encoder. So you'll see this big line through it saying don't do this. Again, we need to use the default password encoder. You shouldn't do this in production. We're just doing this as a demo to kind of keep this a little bit simplistic here. So I'm setting up a username of user, a password of password. I'm setting up a roles of user, and I'm going to go ahead and build that. So that's user one. What I'm going to do then is copy and paste. We're going to go ahead and call our second user here admin. And we're going to give this one both the user role and the admin role. Finally, we're going to go ahead and return a new in-memory user details manager. And if you look at this, this takes a var args of user details, so we can pass in one or more. So I can just say, hey, user and admin, and we should be good to go. So now, if we go ahead and restart this, you will no longer see that generated password in there. That's because once we overrode the configuration for a user, we now have our own users. Boot is not going to create that default one for us. So now we should be able to go over and log in with user and password. So I'm going to say user and password, and it let me in. Okay, so we're making some roads here. So now what we want to do is we want to talk about securing our controller here. So we have this coffee controller. And I have these two methods. I have one for find all, which just returns a list of all the coffee products in the system. Currently there's 3. And then I have one for creating a new coffee product. So what I want to do is say, hey, you should have a role of user to be able to go ahead and list out all of the coffees in the system. Now to do this though, we are kind of saying that, hey, we are controlling security at a method level. And to do this, we need to come back to our security config and we need to add a new annotation here. And we're going to say enable method security. Now, if we jump into enable method security, there are all these defaults. So pre and post enabled is true. Secure enabled is false, which we'll come back to in a second. And then there's some others here. So secure enabled is false. I want to go ahead and enable that. So the way that I can do that is just say secure enabled equals true. And now that I have that, I can come back to my coffee controller and I'm just going to show you both methods in here, but we'll start with the @secured. So the @secured annotation is going to take a value, which is going to be the role. So I'm going to say role underscore user. Now again, you do need to prefix it with role. So we're saying role underscore user. So now anybody with the user role should be able to find all the coffees. So let's go ahead and rerun this. We're going to head back to the browser. And since I'm logged in as that already, let's go ahead and try and write a query. So we're going to say, let's just keep this find all coffee. This is all coffee, which will return an ID, name, and size. And let's go ahead and execute that. And we get our 3 coffees. Okay, so far so good. Now, I don't want any user to be able to create a new coffee. I want to kind of lock that down to the admin role. So there is also another annotation that you can use, pre-authorized. And so this has a little bit more flexibility. It's an annotation for specifying method access control expressions. So again, you can get a little bit more expressive. You can use this Spring expression language to kind of define these. So in here, we're just going to say, hey, we want to just check to make sure they have a role. Whoops, we need to put that in here. And you see we get this nice IntelliSense here. So it has role, and this is going to be of admin. So I'm going to go ahead and rerun this. And what I want to do is log in as user, which I already am. I'm going to go ahead and say mutation, create coffee. And we'll say create coffee. And this is going to take 2 arguments, I think. Yeah, name. So we'll say test. And we'll say size is short. So this is going to return a coffee. So again, ID, name, size. So we're going to go ahead and try and execute this. And it is forbidden. So we are getting a forbidden, a 403. This is exactly what we want. So I, as a user, can come in here and run this one, find all coffees, but I cannot create a coffee. So what I need to do is log in as an admin. And the way I'm going to go ahead and do that is you can do a couple of things. One, I like to just go ahead and say Chrome restart. And I'm going to go ahead and log in as an admin and password. And I'm back here. I should be able to find all coffees. There's our 3. Now I'm going to go ahead and try and mutate. And there you go. So we got back a new coffee with an ID of 4, the name test, and the size of short. So if we go ahead and run find all coffees, we now see that we have 4. All right, so one other thing I want to look at here is talking about the authenticated principle, or who is the current logged in user. And so if we look at our order controller, we have a method here called find all orders. So if I were to call this right now, I would get all of the orders in the system. So if we look at the order service, we create 3 orders, 1 that belongs to user 1, or 2 that belong to user 2. So user has 1 and admin has 2 orders. So finding all orders is not really what we want it to do, right? what we want to do is find all the orders for a given user. So if we look in the order service here, we have this find all method, but we also have a method called find all by username, which takes a string of username and then we'll filter out those orders. Now again, this filtering would be done at the database level, but we're just using an in-memory collection, so this is fine. So we want to call find all by username. So find all by username, and now that is going to take a username. So we need a way to get the user. So fortunately for us, all of our GraphQL methods here in our controller have a number of parameters that it can accept. One of which, and again, I pointed to this in the article, this is in the documentation for Spring for GraphQL. One of such arguments is a principal. So principal, and this will get us the currently authenticated user. This represents the abstract notion of a principal, which can be used to represent any entity such as an individual, corporation, or a login ID. So this is who is logged in. So from principal, we can say principal.getName, and that will give us the string that we're looking for. So what I want to do now is go ahead and stop and restart. And if we head over to here, let's go ahead. We should be logged in as user. So if I say query find all orders, we're going to say find all orders, and this is going to return order ID. What else is there? Ordered on, and then a coffee, which is going to contain the ID, name, and size. So let's go ahead and run find all orders, and you'll see we only get that one order back. We don't get all three back. So let's go ahead and say restart, and we'll go ahead and log in as admin and password. And if we run find all orders now, we get the other two. So cool. Now we actually have a way to get the currently logged in user, and we're using that as part of the query without having to supply it here. We're just figuring out who you are and using that to get all of your orders. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end of this tutorial. I really hope you found it useful. I hope you got something out of it. Again, there's the guide over here on the Tanzu Developer Center if you want to kind of refer back to something. There's code snippets in there, so you can grab all that there. Security is really hard. Thankfully, we don't have to roll this by hand. That would be a real big pain in the butt to do. Thankfully, Spring Security is there for us. We saw how we can go ahead and get some fine-grained control on different controller level or on the service level, and how do we get the authenticated principle. So if you still find yourself with questions after this, whether it's GraphQL in general, GraphQL security in general, a lot of it is, there's a lot to it. So if you have some questions, please go ahead and leave those below. I'd be happy to answer those or even use those to create a new tutorial on. So with that, I really hope you got value out of this. If you did, do me a favor and leave me a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel so that we can get this content in front of more viewers. And as always, friends, happy coding.